Commander Sarah Chun stood on the bridge of the human warship Defiance, watching the massive alien fleet through the viewing screen. Ships from dozens of different species filled the space around them. Some looked like crystal spiders with legs made of pure light. Others were smooth metal spheres that seemed to bend reality around them. The most impressive were the Keeper vessels, ancient ships that looked like floating cities, made of black stone. Sarah felt very small. Her ship was basic compared to these alien marvels. The Defiance was just steel and titanium, powered by simple fusion reactors. Their weapons were kinetic cannons that fired metal slugs and nuclear torpedoes. Nothing fancy. Nothing that could compare to quantum disruptors or stellar fire cannons. The Galactic Confederation had reluctantly allowed humans to join their alliance 3 years ago. Most alien species saw Earth's people as primitive newcomers who had barely figured out faster-than-light travel. They weren't wrong. While other races had technologies that could reshape matter or manipulate time, humans were still using chemical rockets and ballistic weapons. But now everything had changed. The enemy had arrived. Admiral Kethvar of the Altarian fleet appeared on Sarah's communication screen. His blue skin glowed with bioelectric patterns that showed his confidence. "Human vessels will remain in reserve positions," he said without greeting. "This battle requires precision and advanced technology. Your crude weapons would only interfere." Sarah clenched her fists but stayed quiet. She had heard this tone many times over the past 3 years. The aliens meant no real insult. To them, humans were like children playing with wooden swords while adults fought with laser blades. The enemy was called the Vortex Swarm. They had appeared at the galaxy's edge 6 months ago, consuming everything in their path. Their ships looked like giant insects made of metal and flesh combined. Where they passed, entire star systems became empty space filled only with debris and silence. The Confederation's best scientists had studied the enemy and declared them unstoppable. The swarm ships could adapt to any weapon fired at them. They learned and grew stronger with each battle. Worse, they absorbed the technology of defeated enemies, making their own ships more powerful. Sarah watched the tactical display as the Confederation fleet moved into position. Over 2,000 ships from 17 different species formed a defensive line at the Centauri Junction. This was the last choke point before the swarm reached the galaxy's core worlds. If they lost here, billions would die. The Altarian ships led the formation. Their hulls shimmered with quantum fields that could phase in and out of normal space. Behind them came the Zephyri vessels, each one connected to their home star by streams of pure energy. They could channel stellar fire across impossible distances. The Keepers brought their reality-warping technology. Sarah didn't pretend to understand how it worked, but she had seen Keeper ships simply will enemy vessels out of existence. They were the oldest race in the galaxy, with knowledge gathered over millions of years. And then there were the humans. 47 ships hanging back behind the main line, armed with weapons that any other species would consider antiques. Metal bullets and fusion bombs. Not even energy shields. Just thick armor plating. Captain Rodriguez of the Resilient spoke over the human fleet channel. "Anyone else feeling like we brought knives to a laser fight?" "More like rocks to a nuclear war," replied Commander Hayes from the Stubborn. His ship's name fit well with human attitudes. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Humans might be primitive, but they had one thing the other species sometimes lacked: humor in dark times. It helped them deal with situations where logic said they should be terrified. The swarm emerged from hyperspace, like a nightmare made real. The sensors counted over 50,000 ships, each one alive in a way that made Sarah's skin crawl. They moved like a school of metal fish, flowing around obstacles and reforming their patterns without any visible communication. Admiral Kethvar's voice boomed across all channels. "All ships, Fire at will. Show these creatures the might of the Confederation. The battle began with a light show that could be seen from neighboring star systems. Quantum torpedoes streaked through space, leaving trails of distorted reality. Stellar fire painted the void in brilliant colors. Reality itself seemed to bend and twist as the Keepers unleashed their most powerful weapons. For a moment, Sarah felt hope. The alien weapons were magnificent, striking the swarm with forces that could crack planets. Surely nothing could survive such an assault. Then the swarm ships began to change dot. It happened slowly at first. The organic hulls of the enemy vessels started to shift and adapt. Quantum torpedoes that had torn through their armor moments before now bounced off harmlessly. The swarm ships absorbed the stellar fire and began to glow with the same energy. Turning it back on the Zephyr fleet. Sarah watched in horror as Keeper vessels, ships that had survived for eons, suddenly writhed like living things. The reality warping technology that made them so powerful was being turned against them. Their own hulls began to twist into impossible shapes as their weapons backfired. "Impossible," whispered Lieutenant Park at the sensor station. "They're not just adapting. They're learning to use our weapons better than we do." The Confederation line began to break apart. Ship after ship fell silent as the swarm overwhelmed their defenses with their own technology. The quantum fields that protected Altarian vessels became prisons. The stellar energy that powered the Zephyr fleet became funeral pyres. Admiral Kethvar's final transmission was cut short as his flagship simply vanished. Consumed by the same forces that had made it legendary. The retreat order came minutes later. But by then, most of the alien fleet was already running. The survivors fled toward the galactic core, leaving humanity's small fleet alone at the edge of the battlefield. Sarah stared at the tactical display. The swarm was still advancing, now armed with the combined technologies of 17 different species. Their own primitive fleet had been ignored completely, not worth the enemy's attention. Captain Martinez's voice came over the human command frequency. As the senior officer present, command had fallen to him. "All ships, prepare to withdraw. We cannot stand against this alone." Sarah looked around her bridge. Her crew was young, mostly from Earth's first generation of deep space explorers. They had joined the fleet knowing they would probably never see their home world again. But they had never faced anything like this. The weapons officer, Ensign Taylor, spoke without looking away from his station. "Commander, should I power down the kinetic cannons?" Sarah hesitated. Logic said yes. Their weapons were useless against an enemy that had just absorbed the galaxy's most advanced technology. Running was the only sensible choice, but something made her pause. Maybe it was human stubbornness. Maybe it was pride. Or maybe it was the simple fact that running felt wrong when the entire galaxy was counting on someone to make a stand. "Keep the weapons online," she said quietly. "We're not done here yet." The Vorthic swarm moved like a living thing made of metal and death. Admiral Martinez watched from the bridge of his flagship Determination as the enemy ships flowed across the battlefield. They had just finished destroying the most powerful fleet in galactic history, and now they turned their attention to the humans. Martinez was a simple man from Texas who had joined Earth's first deep space navy because he wanted to see the stars. He never expected to end up commanding humanity's entire military force in what might be the galaxy's final battle. But here he was, 47 ships against 50,000, with weapons that belonged in a museum. "Sir," called his tactical officer, Lieutenant Commander Park, "the swarm is changing course. They're coming directly for us." The enemy ships had already shown their terrible ability. They didn't just defeat advanced technology, they made it part of themselves. The beautiful Altarian vessels that could phase between dimensions had become twisted things that pulled other ships into nightmare spaces. The Zephyr ships that channeled stellar fire now burned with the power of dead stars, spreading radiation that killed everything it touched. Worst of all were what had once been keeper vessels. The ancient ships that could reshape reality itself had become living contradictions. They existed and didn't exist at the same time, spreading waves of impossible physics that made nearby space dangerous to enter. "Admiral," said Captain Rodriguez from the Resilient, "we should withdraw now, while we still can. Our ships aren't built for this kind of fight." Martinez nodded. Rodriguez was right. Human ships were tough but simple. They had thick armor instead of energy shields, kinetic weapons instead of quantum disruptors, and fusion reactors instead of stellar cores. Everything about them was basic, practical, and designed to keep working when more advanced systems failed. But they were also completely outmatched. The mathematics were simple and terrible. The swarm had absorbed technologies that were centuries ahead of anything humans understood. They had weapons that could destroy planets and defenses that had already proven they could adapt to anything the galaxy's best minds could create. "Sir," said Commander Chun from the Defiance, "permission to speak freely?" "Go ahead, Sarah. We all know what happens if we run. The swarm reaches the core worlds and billions die. Someone has to try to slow them down." Martinez looked at the tactical display. The human fleet was spread out in a loose formation, looking tiny against the approaching wall of enemy ships. Each swarm vessel was the size of a city, and there were thousands of them. His biggest ship, the Determination, would barely qualify as a patrol boat compared to what they were facing. "Sarah, our weapons can't even scratch their hulls. They've adapted to technology 100 times more advanced than ours." "Maybe," Chun replied, "but we haven't tried yet." The first swarm ships entered weapons range. Martinez gave the order he knew was probably pointless. "All ships, open fire. Target the lead vessels." The human fleet lit up with muzzle flashes and rocket trails. Kinetic cannons hurled metal slugs at significant fractions of light speed. Nuclear torpedoes streaked toward their targets, followed by fusion warheads that could crack small moons. It was impressive by human standards. Enough firepower to sterilize a planet. The weapons struck the swarm ships and seemed to disappear. The enemy hulls absorbed the impacts without even slowing down. Martinez watched his fleet's entire opening salvo accomplish absolutely nothing. "No effect," reported Park. "Their armor is adapting to kinetic impact. The nuclear warheads aren't even leaving scorch marks." Martinez was about to order a withdrawal when something strange happened. The swarm ships stopped. They hung in space, their organic hulls rippling and shifting. Sensor readings showed massive internal activity, as if they were working very hard on something. "What are they doing?" asked Rodriguez. Park studied his instruments. "Sir, I think they're trying to adapt to our weapons, but they're having trouble with something." The tactical display showed the swarm ships attempting different configurations. Their hulls changed shape and composition, cycling through dozens of different forms. Some sprouted the crystalline growths they had taken from Zephyr ships. Others developed the reality warping fields of captured keeper technology, but nothing seemed to work quite right. The ships kept changing, as if they couldn't figure out what they were supposed to adapt to. "Sir," said Chun slowly, "I think they're confused." "Confused?" "Look at what they absorb from the other fleets. Quantum technology that manipulates probability. Stellar energy that exists in multiple dimensions. Reality warping fields that change the laws of physics. All of it incredibly complex and advanced." Martinez began to understand. "And then we hit them with metal slugs and chemical explosives." "Exactly. They're trying to adapt to technologies that don't exist in our weapons. They're looking for quantum processors in our kinetic cannons and exotic matter in our fusion warheads. But there's nothing exotic about throwing a big piece of metal, really. really fast. The swarm ships were still shifting and changing. But now Martinez could see something else in their movements, frustration. The organic vessels were trying to solve a problem that had no solution because there was no problem to solve. All ships, he ordered. Continuous fire. Keep hitting them with everything we've got. The human fleet opened up with sustained bombardment. Every ship poured fire into the swarm formation, filling space with metal and atomic fire. The enemy ships continued their attempts to adapt, but they kept failing. Their hulls would reconfigure to deflect quantum torpedoes that weren't quantum, or absorb stellar energy that was just chemical combustion. For 20 minutes, the impossible happened. The human fleet held their ground against the vortex swarm, not because they were winning, but because the enemy couldn't figure out how to lose to them properly. But it couldn't last. The swarm ships finally stopped trying to adapt and simply began to advance. Whatever advantage confusion had given the humans was wearing off. The enemy had decided that if they couldn't understand human weapons, they would simply ignore them and destroy the ships that fired them. "Admiral," said Park, his voice tight with worry, "the swarm is moving again. They're targeting our ships directly now." The first swarm vessel opened fire with a weapon that had once belonged to a keeper ship. Space twisted around the human destroyer Valiant, and the ship simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed, erased, as if it had never been built. A second human ship, the Persistent, tried to evade a beam of concentrated stellar fire. The energy tore through its armor like paper, turning the crew into vapor and the hull into expanding gas. Martinez watched his fleet die ship by ship. They had managed to confuse the enemy for a few minutes, but confusion wasn't victory. The swarm was learning new lessons now, that human ships were fragile things that could be killed with conventional force. No adaptation needed. "Sir," said Rodriguez over the communication channel, "we need to withdraw. We've done what we can." Martinez looked at the tactical display again. 45 ships remaining out of 47. The swarm had barely slowed down. Beyond them lay the route to the core worlds, where trillions of lives hung in the balance. He reached for the communication controls to give the retreat order. Every logical analysis said they had no chance. His fleet was primitive. His people were outgunned by impossible odds. And his weapons were laughably inadequate. But as his hand moved toward the controls, Martinez hesitated. It was just a pause, lasting maybe 2 seconds. But in that brief moment, something stirred in his mind. A memory of his grandfather, who had fought in Earth's last world war with nothing but courage and an old rifle. A thought about all the times in human history when logic said to give up. But someone decided to try anyway. Martinez's hand stopped moving toward the retreat order dot around the fleet. Other human officers felt something similar. Commander Chun on the Defiance felt it. Captain Rodriguez on the Resilient felt it. Even young Ensign Taylor at his weapons station felt it. They were about to die. Everyone knew it. But for some reason, the idea of running felt worse than the idea of dying. Martinez's hand slowly moved away from the communication controls and settled on the firing controls instead. "All ships," he said quietly. "Hold position. Keep fighting." The pause had ended, but something new was about to begin. The moment stretched like a held breath across the human fleet. Admiral Martinez sat in his command chair aboard the Determination, staring at the impossible odds displayed on his tactical screen. 45 ships against 50,000. Primitive weapons against technology stolen from the galaxy's most advanced civilizations. Every calculation said they should retreat. Every tactical manual ever written said this was suicide. Every logical thought in Martinez's head screamed that staying meant the complete destruction of humanity's space fleet. But his hand would not move to give the retreat order. Around the fleet, something strange was happening. On the bridge of the Defiance, Commander Chun found herself checking her weapon status for the third time. Not because she needed to, but because it felt important to know exactly how much ammunition they had left. On the Resilient, Captain Rodriguez was studying the swarm formation with unusual intensity. Not looking for weaknesses. There weren't any. Just looking. As if memorizing the face of the enemy. That might kill them all. In the engine room of the Stubborn. Chief Petty Officer Williams was running diagnostics on their fusion reactor. The results showed normal operation, but she ran them again anyway. Then again. Something about the numbers felt important, though she couldn't explain why. The pause had infected the entire human fleet like a virus of determination. 45 ships hung in space, not advancing, not retreating, just thinking. Lieutenant Commander Park broke the silence on Martinez's bridge. "Sir, the swarm has stopped their advance. They're watching us." It was true. The vast enemy fleet had halted their forward movement. Thousands of organic ships hung in space like predators trying to understand prey that wouldn't run. Sensor readings showed massive activity inside the swarm vessels, but they weren't moving closer. "They're confused," said Martinez quietly. "They expected us to retreat like the others did." Commander Chun's voice came over the fleet communication channel. "Admiral, I've been thinking about something. The other fleets, they had better technology, better weapons, better everything. But they all ran when their advantages were neutralized." "Your point, Sarah? We don't have any advantages to lose. Our weapons are basic. Our ships are simple. Our technology is primitive. The swarm can't take away what we never had." Martinez nodded slowly. It was a strange kind of logic, but it made sense. Every other species in the Confederation had relied on their superior technology. When that technology was turned against them, they had nothing left to fight with except fear. Humans had never relied on superior technology because they'd never had it. They were used to being outgunned, outmatched, and outnumbered. It was their normal state of existence. "Sir," said Ensign Taylor at the weapons station, "the swarm ships are moving again." The enemy formation began to advance, but slowly. Their movements seemed almost hesitant, as if they were approaching something they didn't understand. The swarm had evolved to fight the galaxy's most advanced civilizations. They had counters for every known weapon and defenses against every possible strategy, but they had no experience with opponents who simply refused to acknowledge that they were beaten. Martinez made a decision that would puzzle military historians for centuries. Instead of ordering evasive maneuvers or defensive formations, he told his fleet to hold position and keep firing. Not because it would work, but because it felt right. The human ships opened fire again with their basic kinetic weapons. Metal slugs and fusion warheads streaked toward the swarm formation. The enemy ships absorbed the impacts without damage, just as they had before. But something was different now. The swarm vessels were no longer trying to adapt to human weapons. Instead, they were trying to understand why the humans were still fighting. Their organic hulls rippled with what could only be called confusion. "Sir," said Park, staring at his sensor readings, "I'm detecting massive neural activity in the swarm ships. It's like they're thinking very hard about something." On the Resilient, Captain Rodriguez was having a conversation with his tactical officer that was being repeated on ships across the fleet. "Captain, we should have been dead 10 minutes ago," said Lieutenant Blake. "I know. The enemy has weapons that can erase ships from reality. They've absorbed technology from 17 different species. They outnumber us 1,000 to 1. I know. So why are we still here?" Rodriguez looked at the tactical display showing the swarm ships advancing toward his position. "Because we're too stupid to realize we're supposed to be dead." It wasn't really stupidity, though it looked like it from the outside. What was happening to the human fleet was something more fundamental. They had reached a point where logic and fear should have taken control, but instead, something older and more stubborn had awakened. It was the same thing that had driven humans to explore dangerous places throughout their history. The same thing that made them try impossible things just to see what would happen. The same thing that had gotten them into space despite having less advanced technology than any other species in the galaxy. They were being human. And for the first time in their brief galactic history, that was exactly what the situation required. Dr. Sarah Patel, the fleet's chief scientist aboard the Determination, had been quietly analyzing the swarm's behavior patterns. She appeared on Martinez's command screen with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Admiral, I think I understand what's happening. The swarm isn't just a military force. It's an evolved response to advanced technological civilizations. They've developed counters for every known form of sophisticated warfare. And we're not sophisticated. We're barely civilized by galactic standards. Our weapons work on principles that were abandoned by other species thousands of years ago. The swarm has no reference point for dealing with opponents who fight like barbarians." Martinez smiled for the first time since the battle began. "Are you saying we're winning because we're primitive?" "Not winning," Patel corrected. "Surviving. The swarm knows how to defeat quantum manipulation and reality warping and stellar engineering. But they've never encountered an enemy that just throws rocks really, really hard and refuses to stop." The first swarm ship reached firing range of the human formation. It opened up with a weapon that had been torn from a keeper vessel, sending waves of twisted space-time toward the destroyer Courage. The human ship's armor buckled and cracked, but the vessel held together. More importantly, it kept firing. The swarm ship tried again with a different weapon, one stolen from the Altarians. Energy beams that should have phased the human ship out of existence instead splashed harmlessly against simple titanium armor. The enemy vessel sensors couldn't understand why their advanced weapons were failing against such basic defenses. The answer was simple, though the swarm couldn't grasp it. The human ships weren't protected by exotic physics or quantum fields. They were just thick chunks of metal with people inside who refused to give up. Across the fleet, the pause that had gripped the humans was evolving into something else. The moment of hesitation was becoming a moment of clarity. They couldn't win this battle with superior technology or brilliant tactics. But they could do something else. They could refuse to lose. Martinez stood up from his command chair and looked around his bridge. His crew was young, inexperienced, and armed with weapons that any other species would consider antiques. They should have been terrified. Instead, they looked determined. "All ships," he said over the fleet channel. "New standing orders. We're not here to win. We're here to make the bastards work for it." The human fleet stopped trying to fight like a modern military force and started fighting like humans. They ignored tactical doctrine and safety protocols. They stopped worrying about ammunition conservation and fuel efficiency. Instead, they did what humans had always done when faced with impossible odds. They got creative, they got stubborn, and they got angry. The pause was over. The real fight was about to begin. What happened next would be studied by xenobiologists and military tacticians for generations. Later, they would call it the Centauri phenomenon, the moment when human nature became a weapon of war. It started in the engine room of the Determination, where Chief Petty Officer Martinez had been staring at her fusion reactor readings. The numbers were normal, safe, and completely inadequate for what they needed to do. "Screw the safety margins," she muttered, and began overriding every protection system the reactor had. The change rippled through the ship's power, grid like electricity through water. Weapons that had been firing at normal capacity suddenly doubled their output. Engines that had been running at recommended levels started pushing the ship faster than it was designed to go. The determination began to glow with excess radiation as every system pushed beyond its limits. Across the fleet, the same realization was spreading. If they were going to die anyway, they might as well die doing something memorable. On the destroyer Valiant's Hope, Lieutenant Jackson made a decision that violated every rule of fighter combat. Instead of using his interceptor to provide cover for the larger ships, he aimed it directly at the nearest swarm vessel and pushed his engines to maximum power. "Jackson, what are you doing?" called his squadron leader. "Something stupid," Jackson replied, and crashed his fighter directly into the swarm ship's hull. The impact should have been meaningless. One small ship against a vessel the size of a city. But Jackson had armed every missile and torpedo on his fighter before impact. The explosion tore through the swarm ship's organic hull, and for the first time in the battle, one of the enemy vessels shuddered. More importantly, the swarm ship tried to adapt to the attack and failed. Its biomechanical systems couldn't figure out how to counter. A weapon delivery system that consisted of crash into target while carrying explosives. Captain Rodriguez watched the explosion from the bridge of the Resilient and felt something ignite in his chest. It wasn't hope. The odds were still impossible. It was something more dangerous than hope. It was inspiration. "All ships," he broadcast on an open channel. "Did everyone see that? The bastards can adapt to quantum torpedoes, but they can't adapt to being hit by a kamikaze fighter." The effect was immediate. Human pilots across the fleet began modifying their tactics in ways that would have gotten them court-martialed in peacetime. Fighters became guided missiles. Torpedoes were chained together to create fusion cascades. Ships began ramming maneuvers that turned vessels into kinetic weapons. Dr. Patel watched the tactical displays with growing amazement. The human fleet was no longer fighting like a military organization. They were fighting like a pack of cornered animals that had suddenly realized their claws were sharper than they thought. "Admiral," she said to Martinez, "the swarm is having problems adapting to our new tactics." "Why?" "Because we're not using tactics. We're just being destructive in random ways. There's no pattern for them to learn from because we're making it up as we go along." On the gun deck of the Stubborn, Master Gunnery Sergeant Williams was having a conversation with her crew that would become legendary. "Chief, the kinetic cannons are overheating," reported Corporal Hayes. "So? If we keep firing at this rate, they'll explode." Williams looked at the swarm ships bearing down on them. "Hayes, in about 5 minutes, everything on this ship is going to explode anyway. Question is, do we want it to explode while we're shooting, or while we're running?" Hayes grinned and turned back to his gun. "Shooting, Chief." The Stubborn's kinetic cannons began firing at nearly twice their design rate. The barrels glowed white-hot, and the weapon system screamed warnings that everyone ignored. But the stream of metal slugs pouring into the enemy formation was unlike anything the swarm had encountered. They tried to adapt their armor to deflect kinetic impacts, but the humans kept changing the ammunition. Depleted uranium 1 minute, titanium steel the next, then explosive rounds that detonated after penetrating the hull. The swarm's adaptive systems couldn't keep up with modifications that were being made by crew members with welding torches and bad attitudes. The turning point came when Commander Chun made a decision that redefined naval warfare. Her ship, the Defiance, was badly damaged and listing to port. Normal procedure would be to withdraw for repairs. Instead, Chen ordered her crew to strip every non-essential system from the ship and connect them directly to the main weapon array. "Ma'am," said her engineering officer, "that will turn the entire ship into a bomb." "Good," Chun replied. "What's the biggest target you can see?" The Defiance limped toward the largest swarm ship in the formation, shedding armor plates and venting atmosphere. To outside observers, it looked like a dying ship making a desperate escape attempt. The swarm vessel ignored it, focusing on more threatening targets. When the Defiance was less than a kilometer away, Chun triggered the overload. The ship didn't just explode, it became a miniature star for 3 seconds, releasing the energy of its entire reactor core, life support systems, and artificial gravity generators in one brilliant flash. The swarm ship absorbed the energy, adapted to the heat and radiation, and prepared to continue fighting. But it couldn't adapt to the psychological effect of watching an enemy vessel deliberately destroy itself, just to hurt them. For the first time since the battle began, the swarm formation hesitated. Admiral Martinez watched the sacrifice of the Defiance and felt something cold and angry settle in his stomach. Sarah Chun had been a good officer and a better person. Her crew had volunteered for a mission they knew was suicide. "Dr. Patel," he said quietly, "I need to understand something. Can the swarm adapt to fury?" Patel looked up from her sensor readings. "I'm sorry? You said they adapt to technology, to patterns, to tactics. Can they adapt to pure human rage?" Before Patel could answer, the communication board lit up with messages from across the fleet. Every ship was requesting permission to go to emergency power. Every captain was proposing modifications that would turn their vessels into weapons of mass destruction. Every crew was volunteering for missions that had no chance of survival. Martinez realized that he was witnessing something that had never happened in galactic history. An entire military force was simultaneously deciding that dying well was more important than living safely. "All ships," he announced over the fleet channel. "New standing orders. Ignore all safety protocols. Ignore all tactical doctrine. Find the most dangerous thing you can think of and do it twice." The human fleet became something between a military formation and a natural disaster. Ships rammed enemy vessels while firing at point-blank range. Reactors were overloaded to create improvised fusion bombs. Crews manually guided torpedoes to their targets, riding them like ancient cavalry charges. The Persistence used its tractor beam to grab a swarm ship and drag it into a collision with 2 other enemy vessels. The Indomitable fired its entire missile complement in a single salvo, then used the empty launchers as kinetic weapons by filling them with metal debris and firing them at maximum velocity. Most dramatically, the heavy cruiser Unconquerable performed the maneuver that physicists said was impossible. Captain Torres ordered his crew to reverse the polarity of their artificial gravity generators and use them as a weapon, creating a localized gravitational anomaly that pulled 3 swarm ships together and crushed them like tin cans. The swarm tried to adapt, but adaptation required understanding. How do you counter an enemy tactic that consists of try something crazy and see what happens? How do you prepare for strategies that are being invented by desperate people with nothing left to lose? The organic ships of the swarm formation began to show signs of something that could only be called confusion. Their biomechanical systems were designed to learn from patterns and develop counters to repeated tactics. But the humans weren't repeating anything. Each attack was unique, improvised, and generally suicidal. Martinez watched his fleet tear itself apart in the process of tearing the enemy apart and felt a grin of satisfaction. They were losing ships at an unsustainable rate, but they were taking swarm vessels with them. More importantly, they were teaching the galaxy's ultimate adaptive enemy a lesson it had never needed to learn before. Sometimes, the most effective weapon wasn't advanced technology or superior strategy. Sometimes, the most effective weapon was simply refusing to be reasonable about the odds. The battle had become something unprecedented in galactic history. A fight between the ultimate expression of evolved technology and the ultimate expression of evolved stubbornness. And for the first time since the battle began, the outcome was no longer certain. The Battle of Centauri Junction lasted 18 hours. By the end, Space itself seemed tired of violence. Admiral Martinez stood on what remained of his bridge aboard the Determination. Half his crew was dead. Most of his ship's systems had been destroyed or deliberately overloaded. The viewing screen showed a debris field that stretched across an entire star system, filled with the wreckage of both human and swarm vessels. But they had won. The victory hadn't come through superior technology or brilliant strategy. It had come through pure, stubborn refusal to accept defeat. When logic said to retreat, humans had advanced. When tactics said to preserve their forces, humans had spent them like coins. When physics said their weapons were inadequate, humans had found ways to make inadequate weapons devastatingly effective. That the turning point had come when the swarm's adaptive systems finally overloaded. Faced with an enemy that used different tactics every minute, the biomechanical ships had tried to prepare for every possible human strategy simultaneously. Their organic brains had essentially suffered a mental breakdown from trying to solve too many problems at once. "Sir," said Lieutenant Commander Park, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "Final count from the surviving ships." Martinez nodded. He already knew it would be bad. 23 ships still operational. 15 more that might be salvageable. The rest? Park's voice trailed off. The rest were gone. Vaporized in nuclear explosions, torn apart by kinetic impacts, or simply burned away when their crews chose to overload every system they had rather than surrender. Of the 47 ships that had begun the battle, more than half had been destroyed, but the swarm was extinct. Every last enemy ship had been destroyed, not just defeated. The galaxy's most adaptive enemy had met an opponent they couldn't adapt to, and it had killed them. "Admiral," came a weak transmission from Captain Rodriguez aboard the Resilient. "We're getting communication requests from the Confederation survivors." Martinez almost laughed. The alien fleets that had fled when their advanced weapons failed were now returning to see what had happened. They found a graveyard filled with primitive human ships and the scattered remains of an enemy that had seemed invincible. The first alien commander to arrive was Admiral Cathvar of the Altarians, whose flagship had been one of the few to escape the initial slaughter. His blue face appeared on Martinez's communication screen, but the usual confidence was gone. Instead, he looked confused and perhaps a little afraid. "Admiral Martinez," Cathvar said slowly, "our sensors indicate that the entire swarm fleet has been eliminated. How is this possible?" Martinez looked around his ruined bridge. Emergency lighting cast red shadows across damaged equipment. The air recycling systems were making unhealthy noises. His surviving crew looked like they had been through a war, which they had. "We got lucky," he said simply. But that wasn't the whole truth, and everyone knew it. Luck might explain surviving impossible odds. It didn't explain systematically destroying an enemy that had adapted to and overcome the galaxy's most advanced military forces. Dr. Patel, working from a portable station since her laboratory had been destroyed, provided a more complete explanation to the gathering alien fleet commanders. The Vorthic swarm was evolved to counter advanced technological warfare, she said during the post-battle briefing. They had responses to every known form of sophisticated attack. Quantum weapons, reality manipulation, stellar engineering. They can adapt to all of it because they understood the principles involved. A Zephyr captain, his crystalline form flickering with confused energy patterns, asked the obvious question. "Then how did you defeat them with primitive weapons?" Patel smiled, though it was a tired expression. "Because our weapons aren't just primitive. They're deliberately simple. And more importantly, we don't fight like a civilization. We fight like humans." The alien commanders didn't understand, and Patel wasn't sure she could explain it in terms they would accept. How do you tell advanced beings that sometimes the most effective strategy is to ignore strategy entirely? How do you explain that humans had won not by being better, but by being too stubborn to realize they were supposed to lose. The rescue and salvage operations took 3 days. Ships from across the Confederation arrived to help with repairs and to study the battlefield. Xenobiologists wanted to examine swarm remains. Military analysts wanted to understand the tactics that had achieved the impossible. But the aliens found something unexpected when they interviewed human survivors. The crews didn't talk about tactical innovations or strategic brilliance. They talked about Chief Martinez pushing her reactor beyond safe limits because she was angry. They talked about Lieutenant Jackson crashing his fighter into an enemy ship because it seemed like a good idea at the time. They talked about ordinary people making extraordinary decisions because somebody had to. Commander Chun, who had somehow survived the destruction of the Defiance in an escape pod, put it best when questioned by a team of Keeper military historians. "You want to know our secret?" she said, sitting in a hospital bed aboard a rescue ship. "We didn't have one. We just remembered that humans have never been very good at knowing when to quit. The galaxy had forgotten that. We reminded it. The political consequences were immediate and far-reaching. The Galactic Confederation, which had reluctantly admitted humanity as junior members, suddenly found themselves dealing with a species that had accomplished what their greatest military mind said was impossible. Some aliens were afraid. If humans could destroy the swarm with primitive weapons and suicidal tactics, what else might they be capable of? Others were impressed. The galaxy's most dangerous enemy was gone, eliminated by a species that most civilizations had considered barely worthy of membership. But the smart ones were thoughtful. They realized that they had been measuring human potential by the wrong standards. Advanced technology and sophisticated strategies were useful tools, but they weren't the only way to solve problems. Sometimes you needed something else. Sometimes you needed the kind of people who would look at impossible odds and decide that impossible just meant they hadn't tried hard enough yet. Admiral Martinez received a message from the Confederation High Council a week after the battle. They were offering him any position he wanted in the unified fleet, command of entire sectors, access to the most advanced technology in the galaxy, resources beyond imagination. He turned them down. Instead, he requested permission to return to Earth and help design the next generation of human warships. When asked why, his answer became famous throughout the galaxy. Because the next time something impossible shows up, I want to make sure we're still too stupid to know we can't beat it. The memorial at Centauri Junction was built from the hull plating of destroyed human ships. It was simple, practical, and built to last, just like the people it honored. The inscription was written in both Galactic Standard and English. Here, 824 human ships fell silent so that the galaxy might never forget. When faced with the impossible, humans don't calculate odds. They pause, smile, and reload. Years later, when new threats emerged at the galaxy's edge, the Confederation's first response was always the same. They called for the humans. Not because human weapons were the most advanced, they weren't. Not because human tactics were the most sophisticated, they weren't. They called for the humans because when everything else failed, humans had a unique talent for finding ways to make failure irrelevant. The galaxy learned many lessons from the Battle of Centauri Junction. The most important was that sometimes the most dangerous opponent isn't the one with the best technology. Sometimes it's the one who simply refuses to acknowledge that they've lost. The Vortex Swarm had been evolution's answer to advanced civilizations. But they had never encountered anything like humanity, a species that treated impossible odds not as a reason to surrender, but as a personal challenge. And in the end, that made all the difference. The memorial's final line, added at Admiral Martinez's request, captured the truth that every human understood, but could never quite explain to their alien allies. They paused. They fought. They won. because that's what humans do. In the years that followed, when historians studied the battle, they would focus on tactics and technology and strategic implications. But the human survivors knew the real secret. They hadn't won because they were better. They had won because